Sometimes a single statistic or maybe just a quote can really make you stop and rethink things. I saw this quote recently. The new immigrants represent not the de-Christianization of American society, but the de-Europeanization of American Christianity.
Wow. That's powerful.
It really is. And it made me think about something I saw myself. I went back to my old high school, the one I attended back in the early 80s.
Okay.
And back then, it felt, well, overwhelmingly white. Maybe a handful of non-white students. Perhaps 20 Korean kids in the whole school, maybe 2,000 students total.
Right, a very different time.
Totally different. So fast forward 30 years, I visit again, and it's like, whoa. Multilingual signs above the restrooms. English, Spanish, Korean, Vietnamese, Cambodian.
That's quite a change.
Huge. And a counselor told me they now have around 400 Korean and Korean American students. 400.
From 20. That's incredible growth.
20 times the number. It's just one school, I know, but it really hits home, that shift the quote talks about.
Yeah. And, your personal story there, it really mirrors the bigger picture, the demographic story happening all across the U.S.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Think about it. Beginning of the 20th century, something like 85% of immigrants, they were coming from Europe.
Right.
By 2000, that number had plummeted to under 16%. Meanwhile, Asian immigration, up to over 26%. Latin America, over 50%.
So those old assumptions just don't hold anymore.
Not at all. And that Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, that was the real turning point. It basically dismantled those old national origin quotas.
And that shift, that's exactly what we're diving into today. We're focusing on Korean Diaspora Churches, KDCs, right here in the USA. We've got some fascinating research looking at, well, their whole story. Their history, how they actually function within the Korean community, the challenges they're facing, and also their unique strengths.
It's a really important slice of American religious life, often one that doesn't get a lot of attention.
Definitely. And understanding these KDCs, it's not just about one specific group, is it?
Not at all. It gives us a lens, really, into these bigger themes: immigration, how cultures adapt, how people build new lives while holding on to their heritage.
But how they reshape the religious landscape, too.
Exactly. It helps us understand those broader dynamics across the U.S.
And the Asian American community overall, I mean, their growth is just undeniable.
Yeah.
Pew Research calls them the fastest growing racial group.
And often with high levels of income and education, too, right?
Yeah, the median income was around $66,000 compared to the U.S. median of about $50,000 a few years back. Plus, recent Asian immigrants, super highly educated, like over 60% have at least a bachelor's degree.
That's remarkable. The most highly educated group of immigrants in U.S. history, I believe.
Yeah, and back in 2010, the big 6 Asian groups were Chinese, Filipino, Indian, Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese. Koreans were just under 10% of that total, which is over 17 million people then.
So you can see how understanding this specific community, the Korean diaspora and their churches, is increasingly vital for grasping the broader American picture.
Right. So our mission today really is to unpack what makes these Korean diaspora churches tick. What role do they play?
Let's do it. Where should we start? The history seems like the logical place.
Okay, yeah. So why did Koreans start coming to the U.S. in the first place? What were the big push and pull factors?
Well, there were definitely strong push factors coming out of Korea itself for much of the last century. You had the threat from North Korea, political instability at times in the South, economic hardship.
Reasons to leave, basically.
Exactly. And then the pull factors from the U.S. side, things like, perceived political stability, the promise of better economic opportunities, and a really strong desire for their kids to get a good education and have a better future.
That makes sense. And this immigration, it wasn't just one big wave, right? It came in phases.
Precisely. Scholars usually talk about 4 main waves. The first one was really early, 1903 to about 1945.
1903?
Yeah. The very first group, 121 Koreans, landed in Hawaii in 1903. Within just 3 years, over 7,000 had arrived, mostly men, looking for work on the sugar plantations.
Tough work, I imagine.
Very tough. And it created a huge gender imbalance. So you also had over 1,000 picture brides come over during that time. Women matched with men in Hawaii, basically through photos.
Picture brides, right. I've heard of that.
But then things change. The Japan-Korea Annexation Treaty in 1910 complicated things. And then the big one was the Immigration Act of 1924.
The Oriental Exclusion Act.
That's the one. It basically slammed the door shut on Asian immigration, ending that first wave.
Okay. So what sparked the second wave?
The second wave picked up after World War II, so roughly 1945 to 1965. Korea had regained independence. This wave was smaller, though.
Who's coming then?
Mostly international students, quite a few Korean women, around 6,000, who had married American soldiers during or after the Korean War.
Ah, the war brides.
Exactly. And also about 5,000 war orphans adopted by American families after the conflict. So different motivations than that first wave.
Definitely different. Then came wave 3, and that sounds like the really big one.
Oh, absolutely. The third wave, say 1965 to 1989, was a direct result of that 1965 Immigration Act we mentioned earlier, the Hart-Celler Act.
Because it got rid of those quotas based on nationality.
Precisely. It opened the floodgates, really. Immigration from Korea just surged. The peak was actually in the 1980s. Over 320,000 Koreans came legally in that decade alone.
320,000 in 10 years. That's massive compared to before.
Huge jump. You can see it clearly in the immigration data.
Okay, so that brings us closer to the present. The fourth wave starts around 1989.
Yes, from 1989 onwards. And this one's interesting because legal immigration actually decreased a bit from that 80s peak.
Oh, so fewer people moving permanently.
Fewer getting green cards, yes. But there was this massive explosion in non-immigrant visitors.
Tourists, students.
Well, all of the above. Tourists, business travelers, tons of international students. This happened largely because South Korea liberalized its rules on overseas travel after the Seoul Olympics in '88.
Ah, okay.
So the number of those I-94 forms, the arrival departure records for visitors, just went through the roof. Under 100,000 in '85, over 1 million by 2007.
So a different kind of movement, but still a huge number of Koreans coming to the U.S., even if temporarily.
Exactly. More short-term stays, study, business. It changed the dynamic.
Which must have impacted the Korean community and the churches already here.
Yeah.
So let's talk about those churches. What do KDCs actually do for the community? What are their main functions?
Well, based on the work of sociologist Pyong-Gap Min, he did a lot of research in the New York area. KDCs really serve 4 key social functions for immigrants.
Okay, what's the first one?
First and maybe foremost, they provide fellowship. Critically, fellowship in their native language.
That comfort zone.
Absolutely. Imagine arriving in a new country, totally different language, culture. It can be incredibly isolating. The church becomes this vital haven.
A place to connect.
Yes, connect with others who share your language, your background, your experiences as an immigrant. It builds that crucial sense of community, of belonging.
I can totally see how important that would be. What's number 2?
Second, KDCs often provide opportunities for social status and leadership roles that might be harder for new immigrants to find in the wider American society.
How so?
Well, in Korean culture, there's often, a strong respect for hierarchy, for elders, for leaders. Within the church, immigrants can become elders, deacons, take on other leadership roles.
So it gives them a sense of recognition, purpose.
Exactly. Empowerment, recognition, a meaningful role in their new environment. It's quite significant.
Okay, that makes sense. What about holding on to their culture?
That's the third major function. KDCs are absolutely crucial for maintaining and passing on Korean cultural heritage.
Like running language schools.
Precisely. Many KDCs operate Korean language and culture schools. Kids born here learn the language, history, traditions, values, often tied in with their faith.
That's huge for keeping the culture alive across generations.
It really is. Just as an example, a few years back in the Chicago area, there were almost 40 of these schools, and over 3/4 of them were run out of Korean Protestant churches.
Wow. Okay. And the fourth function?
The fourth one is providing essential social services, especially when people first arrive.
Practical help?
Yeah, really practical stuff like tips on finding jobs, networking, helping with interpretation or translation. Think doctor's appointments, school meetings, dealing with paperwork.
Things that would be incredibly difficult otherwise.
Definitely. And the research shows most Korean Christians felt their church was really helpful, or at least somewhat helpful, in those early years.
So much more than just a place of worship. They're like community centers, support networks.
Absolutely. And there's one other unique historical function, maybe less emphasized now, but vital back then.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
During the Japanese occupation of Korea from 1910 to 1945, those early KDCs, especially in places like Hawaii, LA, San Francisco, they became major hubs for supporting the independence movement back home.
Really? Fundraising and organizing?
Yes. Fundraising, organizing, keeping the spirit alive internationally. A lot of those early immigrants in Hawaii were already Christian or became Christian, and that faith seemed to fuel their nationalism and activism. It's a powerful part of their history.
That's fascinating. I didn't know that connection.
Yeah.
Okay, so we hear this saying sometimes, almost a joke, that Koreans plant churches wherever they go. Is there truth to that in the U.S.?
Well, it is a common saying, a bit tongue-in-cheek, but yeah, it definitely reflects reality. The number of KDCs in the U.S. just grew and grew, especially after that 1965 immigration law kicked in.
How fast are we talking?
Pretty dramatically. Think about this. 1967, maybe 30 KDCs in the whole country.
30, okay.
By 1989, that number jumped to 1,700.
Whoa.
And then just 8 years later, 1997, it was over 3,300.
That's exponential growth. What about more recently?
By 2010, the estimate was over 4,100 KDCs, spread across all 50 states. Southern California alone had over 1,000.
1,000 in just SoCal.
Yep. And some experts think if you count all the smaller house churches and less formal groups, it could be closer to 5,000.
Incredible. Is there a biggest one?
Reportedly, the largest KDC globally is Sarang Community Church down in Anaheim, California. They're Presbyterian, PCA, and have something like 8,000 members.
8,000 members in one church. Wow. Are there specific denominations that are more common among KDCs?
Yeah, definitely some patterns there. The top 6 are Presbyterian, Baptist, Methodist, Independent churches, Pentecostal, and Holiness churches.
Presbyterian is the biggest.
By a fair bit, yeah. Around 41% of KDCs are Presbyterian. What's really interesting is comparing this to South Korea.
How does it line up?
Pretty closely. Presbyterian, Pentecostal, Methodist, Holiness, they're all major players in both countries. It strongly suggests, that the churches here were heavily influenced by the traditions brought over from Korea.
Makes sense. Any notable differences?
One big one is the Baptists. There is a significantly higher percentage of Baptist KDCs here in the U.S. compared to Korea.
Why is that, do you think?
A likely reason is the Southern Baptist Convention, the SBC. They're the largest Protestant group in the U.S. and have been pretty active in partnering with and supporting Korean church planting efforts here.
That denominational support structure. Got it. Okay, so we've got the history, the functions, the amazing growth, but it's not all smooth sailing, right? Let's talk about some of the challenges KDCs face. The research mentions this idea of islandization. What's that about?
Islandization basically describes this tendency for Korean communities and the churches within them to become somewhat isolated within the larger American society.
Like forming their own bubble.
Kind of, yeah. They often cluster in certain areas, which provides comfort and familiarity, naturally, but it can also lead to a separation from other ethnic groups nearby and from mainstream American life and institutions.
Is that unique to Koreans?
Oh, no, not at all. You see similar patterns with many immigrant groups forming ethnic enclaves. It's a common phenomenon globally.
So how does this islandization play out specifically for the churches, the KDCs?
Well, for KDCs, it often means there isn't a lot of deep, meaningful connection or relationship with, say, the non-Korean churches down the street or even with non-Christian neighbors in their area.
Why does that happen? Language barriers.
Language barriers are definitely part of it, cultural differences too. But there might also be a degree of, let's say, ethnocentricity, maybe rooted in Korea's historically more homogenous culture.
So they kind of exist in their own space.
Yeah, they often occupy this unique third culture space. Not quite like churches in Korea, but not fully integrated into the American church scene either. And while that builds strong internal bonds from a wider Christian perspective, that isolation isn't ideal. The church is supposed to be universal and engaged.
Right, connected to the whole body of Christ. Okay, what about tensions inside the churches? Are there common conflicts?
Oh, yes. Like any community, KDCs definitely experience internal friction. It can pop up between pastors and lay leaders, just among members, and significantly between the different generations.
What are the main triggers?
A fairly recent survey of Korean Christians here, including lots of pastors, found that pastors often pointed to financial matters as a big source of conflict.
Money issues.
Yeah.
Always tricky.
Yep. Other things pastors mentioned were power struggles, basically, between the senior pastor and the church elders or board. Also, just general disagreements and discord among the congregation. And significantly, those cultural clashes between the first-generation immigrants and their American-raised kids.
And did the regular church members see it the same way?
Interestingly, the first-generation lay members often highlighted something different. what they saw as the pastor's lack of quality or spiritual gifts.
Oh, interesting. Like performance issues.
Kind of. That was followed by concerns about just general internal discord and also worries about Christian education for the second generation, whether it was effective.
And anything specific about the pastor's role?
One thing really stood out: preaching ability. Lay members put a huge emphasis on that. Most said it was the #1 factor in choosing a church, and many said they'd leave if the sermons weren't good enough for them.
Wow. High stakes for the pastor.
Definitely. And sadly, yeah, these kinds of internal tensions have sometimes led to churches actually splitting up, though, as we said, growth happens for other reasons, too.
Okay. Another big challenge we hear about is the silent exodus. This sounds serious.
It really is a major concern for KDC leaders. The silent exodus refers to all these English-speaking, mostly U.S.-born Korean Americans who just sort of drift away from the KDC as they become adults.
When does this usually happen?
Surveys show large numbers leave after high school or during college or right after they start their careers.
And do they go to other churches?
Some do, but a really significant number just stop attending church altogether.
Why are they leaving? What reasons do they give?
The top reasons that come up are things like feeling the church lacks vision or hope that speaks to them. The language barrier is still a big one between Korean services and their reality.
Feeling like they don't belong.
Exactly. A lack of real ownership. Some also just move away from faith, become atheist or agnostic, and others switch to mainstream American churches that maybe feel like a better cultural fit.
How is this viewed within the community?
The second generation themselves, many see it as a really dire situation for the future of faith in their community. Now, it's true that young people leaving church is a wider trend everywhere.
Yeah, not just a KDC issue.
Right. But the specific cultural and linguistic factors within KDCs definitely add unique pressures that fuel this particular exodus.
And it seems linked to another problem.
Yeah.
A shortage of Korean American pastors who can relate to these younger English-speaking generations.
That's spot on. The lack of U.S.-born, English-speaking Korean American pastors is both a cause and maybe a consequence of the silent exodus.
A national crisis is what one pastor called it.
Yes, a veteran Korean American pastor used that exact phrase. It's a serious problem.
Why is it hard to keep English ministry pastors in KDCs?
The main reasons they leave often circle back to culture clashes, communication problems with the first-generation leadership, maybe feeling they lack a specific calling to that context, getting calls from other churches, sometimes feeling inexperienced or unsupported, and occasionally, lower pay compared to Korean-speaking roles.
So they don't stay long.
The average time an English ministry pastor stays at a KDC tends to be pretty short, unfortunately, which creates even more instability.
And this problem is getting worse because of who's going to seminary, right?
Yes, that's a really worrying trend highlighted in the research. The number of Korean American students enrolling in mainstream U.S. seminaries is low and seems to be dropping, especially when you compare it to the number of Korean-speaking students or international students coming from Korea to study theology here.
Can you give an example?
Sure. A survey back in 2007 found at one major seminary, there were 370 Korean-speaking students, but only 20 English-speaking Korean-American students.
370 versus 20? That's a huge gap.
Massive. And it raises huge questions about the future leadership pipeline. Who's going to pastor these growing English-speaking congregations?
Especially since more and more Korean Americans are English dominant.
Exactly. There's this growing need for pastors who get both cultures, Korean and American, and speak fluent English. But the seminary numbers suggest we're heading for a potentially huge shortage, which could make that silent exodus even worse.
There also seems to be a tricky situation with leadership transition overall between the generations.
Yeah, that's another complex piece. Back in the 90s, the thinking was, okay, the first generation immigrants will age, their numbers might decline, so the Korean language ministries, KM, will shrink.
And the English ministries, EM for the kids, would grow and take over.
That was the expectation, but it hasn't quite panned out like that. Well, partly because of the silent exodus, the EM isn't always growing as expected, but also you still have that steady stream of non-immigrant visitors from Korea students, workers who need and attend Korean language services. So the KM need remains strong.
So the handover isn't happening smoothly.
And the actual transition of senior leadership, From the founding first-generation pastors to the 1.5 generation, those who came as kids, and bridge the gap that's been slower than hoped in many larger churches.
Why the delay?
Partly because you still have very capable pastors coming from Korea for advanced degrees, and sometimes they get called into those senior roles, which is great talent, but...
But it can leave the 1.5 gen leaders feeling stuck.
Exactly. They might have served for years, feel ready, but the top spots aren't opening up. That can lead to disillusionment.
Okay, one last challenge area the research mentions, the undocumented population.
Right, this is really important, but often hidden. Back in 2011, the estimate was around 230,000 undocumented Koreans in the U.S. That was a jump from the year before.
230,000. That's a lot of people.
It's a significant chunk of the Korean diaspora here, and about 2% of the total undocumented population in the U.S. at the time.
And they face unique struggles, obviously.
Huge struggles, constant fear of deportation, difficulty finding stable work, getting health care, just navigating daily life.
So the question for KDCs is,
how are these churches serving these very vulnerable, documentless members? Not just spiritually, but practically. It's a critical challenge for them.
wow, okay, those are some really significant hurdles, but it's not all challenges. The research also points to some real strengths and opportunities for KDCs. Let's shift to those. High church attendance seems to be one.
Yes, definitely. Despite all those challenges, KDCs generally show really high levels of church attendance and affiliation within the Korean community here.
How high are we talking?
Well, using 2010 numbers, with about 1.73 million Koreans estimated in the U.S. then, there was roughly one Korean American Protestant church for every 417 Korean residents.
One church for every 417 people. That sounds incredibly high.
It really suggests Koreans might be one of the most, if not the most, churched ethnic groups in the U.S. The ratio varies state by state, of course, but overall engagement is remarkably strong.
Another strength often mentioned is prayer life.
Oh, absolutely. This is frequently pointed to as a key reason for their growth, their resilience. There's a great quote from missiologist Tetsunao Yamamori. Every significant movement begins with prayer and is sustained by prayer.
And KDCs really live that out.
Many do, deeply. That Korean tradition of early morning prayer services, it's very common here, often 5 or 6 days a week, starting super early before work, plus regular weeknight prayer meetings. It's just fundamental to their spiritual practice.
That's serious dedication. What about reaching out? Evangelism.
That's another key strength. For many Koreans who weren't Christian back home, the whole experience of immigrating seems to create an openness to hearing the gospel message.
So people convert after arriving here.
It happens a lot. Even way back with those first immigrants to Hawaii, a surprisingly high number were Christian or became Christian soon after arriving.
And more recently.
By 2002, some estimated up to 70% of the Korean diaspora here attended church, and Pew data from 2012 showed a very high percentage identifying as Protestant or Catholic, much higher than the Christian percentage back in South Korea.
Why do people convert here? Loneliness.
That's often part of it, yeah. Loneliness, homesickness in a new place, also being invited by friends or family who are already part of a church, or simply not having strong religious ties before leaving Korea, or maybe following Buddhism there but being open here.
Makes sense. And finally, KDCs seem to share that famous Korean passion for global missions.
Oh, absolutely. Korea's commitment to global missions is just phenomenal, world-renowned.
What are the numbers like?
By 2012, get this, over 23,000 Korean missionaries serving in 169 countries.
23,000.
Compare that to 1955, when there were just 2 missionaries in one country. It's an incredible story of growth.
And the U.S. churches play a big role.
Huge role. The Korean World Mission Conferences, often held here in the U.S., help mobilize that effort. And KDCs here support missions massively financially, through prayer, and by sending their own people, short-term and long-term.
So money and people flow out from the U.S. KDCs.
Yes, but interestingly, there's also mission happening in reverse, coming to the U.S.
Korean missionaries working here.
Exactly. In 2010, there were over 1,400 Korean missionaries serving right here in the States.
What are they doing?
All sorts of things. Some are studying in seminaries, some are planting churches for Korean communities, others are in specialized ministries, multi-ethnic work, homeless outreach, campus ministry, even working with Native American and First Nations communities.
Wow, so mission is flowing both ways. That's fascinating. Okay, taking all this in the history, functions, challenges, strengths, what are the big missiological implications? What does this mean for their mission, their purpose?
Well, one big takeaway is that historically, Korean churches have been super focused on overseas missions, which is amazing, but sometimes
They maybe overlook the mission field right here.
Exactly. There's a growing recognition that the U.S. itself, with all its diversity, is a strategic mission field. KDCs need to be intentionally engaging in cross-cultural ministry right in their own neighborhoods.
So balancing that great commission to go global with the great commandment to love your neighbor right here.
Precisely. And loving your neighbor in the U.S. today increasingly means reaching across ethnic and cultural lines within your own community.
That makes a lot of sense. What else?
Another critical point comes back to that leadership issue. Those low declining numbers of 1.5 and second-gen Korean Americans in seminary.
Yeah, the potential pastor shortage.
It's urgent. KDCs really need to prioritize encouraging, supporting, mentoring that next generation. They need leaders equipped for multi-ethnic, multilingual ministry here. Without them, those challenges we talked about, the silent exodus, cross-cultural engagement, they just get harder.
So investing in future leaders is key.
Absolutely. And related to that is the need to build bridges.
Moving beyond islandization.
Yes. Intentionally investing in racial reconciliation, building real unity, collaborating with other ethnic Christian groups here in the U.S.
Partnering up.
Working with existing mainstream networks and organizations too, like Mission America Coalition or Ethnic America Network, pooling resources, maximizing impact together.
So the bottom line is moving from being islands to building bridges.
That's a great way to put it. KDCs have been vital islands of faith and culture. But moving forward, the call is really to build those strong bridges within their own generations and bridges out to the wider American society to share God's love effectively with all their neighbors, Korean and non-Korean alike.
Okay, so bringing this all together, quite a journey we've taken today. We traced the history of Koreans coming to the U.S., the incredible growth of their churches, these KDCs.
We looked at how vital they are, providing community, keeping culture alive, offering real support.
But also facing real challenges. That silent exodus is a big one. Leadership transitions are tricky.
Definitely complex issues. But then you have these amazing strengths, too. The deep prayer life, the passion for sharing faith, that incredible commitment to global missions.
Yeah. So it leaves us, and you, our listener, with something to think about, right?
Absolutely. Given all these changes within the Korean community, within America itself, what does the future hold for these really vibrant churches?
And maybe, what role can we all play, whether we're inside or outside these communities, in fostering connection, understanding, helping them navigate these challenges?
Yeah, how do you balance preserving culture with integrating? How does religious identity keep evolving in a world like ours? Lots to chew on there.